A few weeks ago, I drove Kia's new EV9 for the first time. I didn't have a great deal of time to spend with it, however, so I wasn't able to give you official scores or talk about exactly how it stacked up against the gasoline and electric competition, so all of that is going to happen in this video. Also in this video, I'm going to be answering a lot of questions that you posted over on our Facebook page. So if you want to engage with us over there, be sure to head over to facebook.com/theautobuyersguide. The first question is, what on earth do these wheels look like without the aero covers? There are alloy wheels under the aero covers, but it's clear by their design that Kia doesn't really intend you to drive the EV9 without those aero covers on. How much of a difference do they make out on the highway? Kia wasn't overly specific, but they said it's probably less than a 5% difference in range. A bigger difference in range would likely be swapping out these wheels for a different aftermarket design. So if you're concerned about the look here, really keep in mind the aero profile of any sort of aftermarket wheel that you might want to put on an EV9. Without doubt, the most commonly asked question about the EV9 is, okay, it's big and boxy, but how big and how boxy are we talking? Well, this is just over 197 inches long, so it's about the size of a Kia Telluride and actually a little bit shorter than that Dodge Durango. But as you can see, it is actually boxier than the Durango and bigger in a number of key dimensions. The roofline is actually a little bit taller than the Durango. The hood, actually a little bit higher and a little bit boxier, even though this has a big pushrod V8 engine under the hood. And the entire design really lends itself to the practicality that we see on the inside of the EV9. When you take a look at so many SUVs, not just EV SUVs, but also gasoline SUVs like this, the roofline generally drops a little bit towards the rear. It's not excessive in a vehicle like the Durango, but it certainly does drop down. Also, because of the realities of the gasoline drivetrain, they can't have a completely flat floor inside. Some SUVs will have a flatter floor than others, but generally speaking, they do end up tearing up as far as the floor level as you go towards the rear. Really noticeable in a rear-wheel drive vehicle like this Durango. Big transmission hump up front, decently higher third-row seats off the ground than the front seats. That's not happening in the EV9 because we have a really long wheelbase that allows them to give us very square door openings. In fact, the door openings are taller than the ones on the Durango. These I measured, they're about 2 inches taller as far as the actual door opening, and the rear doors are considerably squarer because they were able to push the wheelbase out really long. And then we have that flat battery pack in the rear. We don't have a taller gas tank, we don't have a rear differential, etc. in the way. Even though we do have a motor in the back, the packaging is pretty well done. So the third row seats, they do tear up a little bit, but their footwell is basically the same level as the front foot level. So you don't have that sort of stadium style seating. Instead, you have maybe more of an electric minivan kind of feel. One of the things that really surprised me about the EV9 is just how wide it is inside, especially in the third row and in the cargo area behind. It's definitely above average for a mid-size 3-row SUV. Certainly wider in the back, even though we're missing a seat versus a Toyota Highlander. And the cargo area is actually wider than the Dodge Durango behind me. The reason that's so surprising is because most EVs, including the 3-row EV competition, generally speaking tapers in dramatically towards the rear. Imagine looking at a small boat from a helicopter above. We find that tapering in the rear for much the same reason that we find it in a boat. It's all about aerodynamics here, obviously hydrodynamics in the boat. But with the EV9, they have given us a very slight tuck-in towards the back and a bit of an optical illusion to make you think that that's kind of what's going on. It's this tail light right here and the broad-shouldered design. Now, the broad-shouldered design has to be here because of the tires. These are the widest tires Kia has ever put on a vehicle sent to North America. They're 285/45 R21s. What's surprising about that is that a 700 horsepower Dodge Durango Hellcat has tires that are only 10 millimeters wider. The big tires, the wide haunches, and the tall roofline definitely give the EV9 more of a presence than it appears in photos. This roofline is definitely higher than average for the midsize SUV segment, as are the door openings. According to my trusty tape measure, this door opening is not just 2 inches taller than the Durango's door openings, it's actually about 2.5 inches taller than a Toyota Highlander as well. So getting in and out is going to be a lot easier for people, especially with mobility issues, or if you're trying to get child seats in and out of the EV9. Now, if you want to know more about child seats, I have a separate video on that where I've already taken a deep dive into how well they fit in here. But the other thing you should know while we're talking about access is that we have a relatively low sill height. Ground clearance is not enormous on the EV9. You will certainly find higher ground clearance in something like a Pilot Trail Sport, But because of the way they've integrated the battery pack into this vehicle, they do give us a relatively high seating position, a relatively low floor, so a pretty comfortable and upright seating position generally. Space efficiency is really the name of the game with the EV9, but one thing that did surprise me is that the hood is relatively long. It's actually about as long as this hood that covers a 6.4-liter V8 engine. We do have a shorter bumper overhang in the front, and the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the driver and the dashboard are actually closer to the front of the vehicle in the EV9 than something like this Durango. We get a slightly longer dashboard in the Durango, and everything has to get pushed further back because of the way the engine and transmission are sitting in there. In an EV, we don't have that particular space constraint, so they can push everything just a little bit further forward and just make it more space efficient. Before people get upset in the comment section, because I know what's going to happen, this is not an EV9 versus Durango video. Although I will say, if you are looking for a mainstream 3-row SUV that will do 0 to 60 in well under 5 seconds, you basically have two options in the US. One of them is going to have a Dodge logo on the hood, and the other one's going to have a Kia logo on the hood. Yes, the Ford Explorer ST exists, but it is notably slower 0 to 60 than this EV9. On the other hand, the EV9 price-wise is a little bit more expensive than some of those performance options, depending on exactly how you configure it. So let's take a dive into pricing first, because you probably need to understand the pricing to really understand how the EV9 fits into the landscape. This starts at $56,395. That includes the destination charge, but does not include any tax treatment. If you lease this, they'll give you $7,500 off of the capitalized costs on the lease. If you don't and you buy it, Kia is currently giving you $3,750 off. That's because later this year, production of the EV9 is going to move from South Korea to Georgia, and this will qualify for half of the federal tax credit. So Kia just wants to make the prices the same. So for the Korean-built models, they're putting $3,750 on the hood. For the North American-built models, it will just be the IRS tax credit. At the moment, the EV9 is available in 4 different power outputs, but somewhat unusually, the base model is not going to be the slowest. That would be the long-range rear-wheel drive, because it uses the same battery as this GT line trim does, 99.8 kilowatt hours, but because the battery voltage actually drops in the bigger battery versus the smaller battery, power from the rear electric motor goes from 215 horsepower down to 201. But range goes all the way from 230 miles combined up to 304. If you want all-wheel drive, you have to step up to the wind trim. That's going to be at least $65,395. Range is, of course, going to drop down to 280, but you get 379 horsepower. If you want the most power and the most torque, you want this GT line trim. You get still 379 horsepower, but they unlock a whole lot more torque. And that's how this goes 0 to 60 in under 4.5 seconds. But the minimum point of entry here is going to be $75,395. In between those, we get the Land all-wheel drive trim. That's where 6 seats start. You also get the upgraded lights up front, a bunch of other goodies on the inside as well, for a mid-level price, $71,395. When it comes to charging speeds, there are a lot of different factors at play. There's the general pack design, there's chemistry, there's cooling, etc., but also battery pack voltage. And the voltage of the pack is likely the reason that the bigger battery pack has a slightly lower peak charge rate than the smaller battery pack. However, it's still a very fast charging curve. This battery will go 10% to 80% in about 25 minutes. The smaller battery pack takes just 18 minutes. Now, some of that difference, of course, is because it's a smaller battery, so you're stuffing less power into it, and clearly that's going to take less time. But the more impressive number for this pack, at least for me, is that in our testing, it went from 10% to 100% in about 50 minutes. And that means that if you do need to absolutely maximize your range, it's going to take considerably less time in this than a number of other big battery EVs out there. But the fastest charge rates are certainly going to be from about 10% state of charge to about 50 to 60% state of charge. Now's a good time to talk about range. 304 is the longest range, 230 is the shortest range. This one sort of splits the difference at 270 miles of range. But as I continually remind people, this is not 270 miles of highway range. This is the EPA combined cycle, so it's based on 297 city, 243 highway. That's how you get 270 combined. If you're shopping for a new EV and you're considering road tripping your new EV, my personal rule of thumb is take the EPA combined range score, take about 40% off the top, and that's the realistic road trip range. And I'm talking about road trip range between stops. Clearly you could go further and you could charge the battery completely full and get more range, but for most folks out there, they're gonna pull into the DC fast charge station at 10 to 15%. They're gonna charge up to 80, maybe 85%, so you're not really exercising the entire battery. It's gonna take longer to go all the way to 100% than to just stop again for another 5 or 10 minutes somewhere. It's really not a big issue with a fast charging EV like the EV9. A lot of folks were asking about the LiDAR sensors, or the lack thereof on the North American model. You'll notice none up front on this GT line. They were certainly there on the prototypes, and they may be there in some other markets around the world. I don't have firm answers from Kia because honestly they dodged questions when I asked them directly about this, but price is probably one of the factors. This is already pushing $80,000, so they may have felt that the LiDAR sensors were just a bridge too far price-wise. We also don't know if the software is quite ready yet there for the LiDARs. They could be used for expanded autonomy, they can also be used for expanded autonomous emergency braking and safety system activation, etc. But Kia has not been overly specific about exactly how those LiDAR sensors will and won't be used in some markets where they may be available. When you jump inside the EV9, the first thing you're going to notice is that this looks very wide. The second thing you're going to notice is that it is actually very wide. In fact, we have about 4 inches more hip room in here than we find in a Tesla Model X. And that's roughly the distance from that door panel over there in the lower portion of the door panel over to the driver's side door panel. In fact, this interior door to door inside is actually wider than that Dodge Durango over there, and even a little bit wider than a Kia Telluride. So it's not just the very horizontal style of the dashboard, this interior is indeed wide and practical. The other thing again that I was surprised by was the door openings. They're certainly wider than the average 3-row SUV as well. Then we get a lot of the traditional benefits of a battery electric vehicle on a dedicated platform, including the flat floor up front, and that extends almost all the way to the rear. You can see that Kia gives us some storage bins there located in the center console, and then more storage going on up here. I do kind of wish that maybe they had thought about that storage area a bit more, perhaps given us some bag hooks or something like that, or some sort of closable bin, but it is definitely very, very usable as it is. The other thing you'll notice is that the interior is just as boxy as the exterior. So very unlike, for instance, a Tesla Model X, the roofline doesn't drop after the second row seats. It stays very, very horizontal, and that really gives us that feeling of space in the back. And unlike other 3-row EVs, say from Mercedes and even from Rivian, you'll also notice that we don't get much of a pinch in on the side. So in, for instance, a Rivian, this pillar here is actually going to be closer to your head because the body actually narrows in as it goes up towards the roofline. And here we have quite a lot of room next to your head and a lot of shoulder room as well. Since this is the top end trim, we have the dual pane moonroof setup. We have one large one over the second row that does not open and one smaller one up front that does open. One odd twist though, the shade on that second row is powered and this one is manual. One thing that continues to bug me a little about this interior, and I am speaking about the GT line with the lounge seat option, is that we get different head restraint designs for the different rows of seating. So as you can see, we have sort of a mesh style headrest up front, butterfly headrests in the second row for a bit more head support if you want to lounge out, and then a very plain headrest back there in the third row. The reason that bugs me a little is because you can see all 3 rows from the rearview mirror. Some of you may recall that I had an EV6 for about a year. I have to admit that the interior of that EV6 felt a little bit more premium in some areas than this EV9, even though it is less expensive. That probably has to do with the bigger battery pack and some of the other realities going on. But this also is showing off a new design direction for Kia, with touches like the heated and ventilated controls for the front seats on the doors rather than on the dashboard. We also get a differently designed dashboard than we've seen in other Kia models. Thankfully, a lot less shiny black plastic than we found in that EV6, however. We also get their newest infotainment system up here in the dashboard. You can see it doesn't just support newer graphics, it also supports wireless Android Auto and wireless CarPlay, which is a first in the Kia lineup for their larger format infotainment system. We also get a few more ways to control or at least monitor the EV system. So if I go over here to this EV option, you can see things like your electricity usage, where it's been going over time, where it's going now, the range estimation history, the economy history, and there's also a dedicated precondition button going on here. So you can actually choose to precondition the battery. Right now it says the battery temperature is suitable for DC fast charging. Previously, they sort of bundled everything into a winter mode. Now they have more of a dedicated battery conditioning mode. The one thing I dislike about this interior, though, are the climate controls. They're on this separate little touchscreen that bridges the gap between these two big LCDs in the dash. But if you're driving the EV9, that control is sort of in this zone right there, just behind that part of the steering wheel, and it does mean that you end up having to lean over one way or the other to actually see where on this little touchscreen you should start stabbing. And some of the options are a little on the small side. So for instance, if you're the driver and the kids are complaining in the back and you want them, or you want to adjust their climate control, you have to touch that little option right there. The controls are just a little small on that particular screen. I really wish that they had given us duplicate controls in the big touchscreen or some physical controls below for some of those functions. Now, we do have fan speed and temperature and the mode operation for that system right in here, but you can't control everything with those toggles. You do have to use that touchscreen for some. It's also worth noting that I didn't have a problem with this, but some passengers kept resting their fingers on these touch buttons integrated into this trim strip, and that can be kind of annoying. Two big air vents right there. Again, lots of storage going on in the middle. This is the optional fingerprint reader. We have a 360-degree camera system, hill descent control, auto brake hold in here, and again, no real shiny black plastic going on here, so that's a nice touch. We have a somewhat small covered storage area. I do wish there was a little bit more covered storage going on in the front, but the main reason for that is because we have quite a lot going on here in the rear. So you can see I can pull this bin out in the back, and it's a really huge storage area. It's not quite wide enough for a gallon of milk, but you could definitely put half gallons in there, and then you can pull out this little table, and that actually extends even further if you want to give your kids or something like that a place for them to eat lunch or something along those lines. Two big cup holders right back there for the rear seats as well. And as we see in other Hyundai and Kia models, controls here so you can recline or scoot the front seat forward or backward. A lot of you asked me about the shifter. I actually like the location here on the steering column. The power button, however, I do wish that was on the dashboard because I found reaching in there for the power button to be just a little bit awkward. And in case you're wondering, yes, you do have to actually use that power button. You can't just hop in here, put your foot on the brake, and then rotate that control over to drive. Also, something that I hadn't expected, even though we get the new instrument cluster and infotainment software in here, I don't think this display is as configurable as I would like. I would love to see a moving map display, something along those lines here, but instead we get basically three different looks that look very similar. There's this one, and then there's one where the little bars on the side are either angled up top or angled down below. It's not really an enormous change as far as the design. The steering wheel, I do find that to be comfortable and attractive, however. I know that not everybody is a fan of this design, but I think I would get used to it. Instead of the shiny black plastic, we do have shiny gray plastic. This is probably going to be just as likely to scratch, but it's not going to be as visible when it does. Over here we have the controls for the standard adaptive cruise control, the aggressive lane centering software, and then over here on this side we have some infotainment controls. To the left of the steering wheel, we find a button that we haven't seen in a Kia EV before. That's a double press to open the hood because, of course, we have that storage area under there. And in case you're wondering, yes, there is also a hood release button on the remote control. That's what that looks like. Over to the left of that, on the driver's door, we have the controls for the front seat massage, the heated steering wheel, heated and ventilated seats, and the seat memory buttons. It's now time to get the EV9 out on the road. I have set the destination to our local Tesla supercharger station with the Magic Dock. I'll talk more on that in just a little bit. And that means that I have also turned on the battery preconditioning because the battery was a little bit chilly. It's 45 degrees outside, and right now the battery is just around 19%. But this is a good time to talk about acceleration because it is surprisingly swift in all versions of the EV9, or at least the feel. Even down here at 20%, I still managed to record a 4.6 second 0 to 60. That was just 1/10 of a second slower than when the battery was full. This sort of mirrors what I've noticed in the Ioniq 5, the Ioniq 6, the EV6, etc. Hyundai and Kia have been very aggressive at their battery designs when it comes to cooling, charging speeds, and performance levels. Performance is very, very consistent. And that's not something that we see in every EV out there. A decent number of the competition won't have a consistent 0 to 60 time all the way across such a broad range of states of charge. Yes, battery performance is going to start degrading south of 20%. We'll see what it gets a little bit later here, but it is always going to be fairly swift. At other points in this video, I accidentally say this went 0 to 60 in under 4.5 seconds. Sorry about that. I meant to say exactly 4.5 seconds. So again, sorry about that. Definitely faster than this is the Tesla Model X, and you don't need the Plaid to get faster. The regular Model X is going to be faster than this model. Also a little bit faster, the Rivian R1S, even if you get the dual motor model, not the quad motor model. But interestingly, this is actually a little bit swifter in this trim than the Volvo EX90. We don't have official 0 to 60 scores, but just going off Volvo's estimates there, they're estimating that's actually going to be a little bit slower than this model. Exact curb weight references are not quite available just yet, but that's probably going to factor into that number a bit. Also, the way that different manufacturers ramp their power levels up and down is a little bit different. If you get the base version of this, it's going to go 0 to 60 in 8.8 seconds. I was very briefly able to experience a base model from a local Kia dealer. I actually found that the acceleration time was perfectly acceptable. It doesn't really feel that much slower than a Kia Telluride because of the way the power is delivered, and in passing maneuvers, it can actually feel a little bit swifter than the Telluride as well. However, at higher highway speeds, passing maneuvers are going to feel a little bit slower just because of the way EVs are often geared. Bearing in mind that it was raining every day this past week, I was able to find a slightly drier section of the road and do some braking tests. In my testing, it only took 119 feet for this to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That's definitely impressive, and I had expected this to be notably longer than that, but you can likely thank the 285 with tires. You can also thank those wide tires for the excellent handling ability in the EV9. This is not going to hold the road quite like an Explorer ST. It's not going to hold the road like a BMW X7 or anything like that, but it is surprisingly capable. I'm also intrigued by the way Kia decided to program this drivetrain. This has a symmetrical motor setup, which is a little bit different than the Kia EV6. That has a bigger motor in the back, a smaller motor in the front. In this all-wheel drive model, the motors are essentially equal as far as their power output capability, but they always bias power towards the rear, a little bit of a surprise for ostensibly a family 3-row vehicle. Even in the normal mode, the rear motor is the one doing the propulsion right now. If I floor it, it's going to engage the front electric motor, or if I engage this 4-wheel lock, it's going to try and balance power more equitably between the front and the rear. And you will notice the difference, actually. Going around that corner with the 4-wheel drive lock mode on versus going around this corner power on just with the steering wheel turned, the car is certainly programmed to send much more power to the rear axle, and it really makes the EV9 feel a lot more nimble than you might think. Ride quality is one of the areas where I think the EV9 does a little bit better than I had originally estimated. Out on this rougher gravel road surface, which has become considerably rougher over the last week since we've received 10 inches of rain in the last 7 days, I think it actually does relatively well. Compared to the average mainstream family 3-row crossover, however, it is still on the firm side. So if you're looking at something like a Grand Highlander or a Honda Pilot, certain versions are going to be a little bit softer than this, but actually certain versions of the Pilot will be a little bit firmer as well. Versus the Kia Telluride, the close corollary in the Kia lineup, I do think this comes across as just a little bit firmer, but not upsettingly so. I think actually the ride quality is a pretty decent balance between handling ability and the ride quality, and a vehicle that you really could use for longer highway journeys. Just keep in mind it is not going to be quite as cushy as some. Firm and bouncy is something that we see in a lot of big battery EVs, for good reason. There's only so much suspension travel available, and they have to try and damp a decent amount of curb weight, more curb weight than in many comparable ICE vehicles, although it depends on the vehicle's exact design. Something similar is going on here in the EV9, of course. Versus a Kia Telluride, there's more weight to control, but the suspension doesn't really have much more motion available than you find in a Kia Telluride. On the other hand, there's certainly a lot more motion available in this suspension design than in something like, say, a Ford Mustang Mach-E or a reasonable amount of slinkier and sexier EVs out there, which is probably why the ride quality is on the better side of things here. At 50 miles an hour, I measured 69 decibels in the cabin, easily putting this in the same category as the Tesla Model X and the Rivian R1S as far as cabin quietness goes. Also, honestly, in basically the same category as the considerably more expensive Mercedes-Benz EQS. That's available with a fairly small third row as well, but it's not actually going to be that much quieter. It is, however, going to be more fuel efficient, and that is definitely the one downside to the boxy nature of this, but I have to parse that a little bit here. A Rivian R1S is going to be less efficient than this. It is just about as boxy. The profile in the back is not quite as wide as this, but it has a huge amount of ground clearance, and it has wheels and tires that are considerably less aero-focused than the ones that we find on this EV9. And that's why it's going to be less efficient in general terms. It's also why it needs a bigger battery pack in order to go as far as this. On the other hand, you won't really get appreciably longer range in something like the Tesla Model X, even though it's shaped like a jelly bean, but you will get a little bit more range in the Mercedes-Benz EQS, if your pockets are deep enough, of course. When it comes to the efficiency score, I'm going to give this model an A+, with an asterisk, because of that comparison factor. The format of the body of this vehicle is closer to the R1S, and versus the R1S, this is more efficient. It is less efficient than a Model X, but the delta is actually smaller than you might think, especially given the jelly bean-like profile that we find in that Tesla. We don't really know where the EX90 is going to fall in amongst these other options, but I expect it actually to be fairly close to this EV9, given the extra battery size and the relatively modest bump as far as range as we get out of that bigger battery pack.
Now it's time to dive into pricing and comparisons. For 2024, the EV9 will start at $56,395. That gets you the base model with 230 miles of EPA combined range. Now keep in mind that's not highway range. That would be 201 miles of EPA highway range. And if you're only using 70% of the battery, going from 10% to 80% on those DC fast charge cycles, then your realistic range there is about 140 miles. So on a lot of road trips with that base model, you'll be stopping every 120 to 150 miles to recharge the battery. I don't think that's too big of a problem for a lot of folks, but it is something that people should keep in mind if you are planning on, taking the family to Disneyland, something like that. If you get carried away with options on your top-end GT line trim, that will be $78,885. That is definitely pricey for a Kia, but as we're going to see here, it's actually less expensive than you might think compared to the other three-row vehicles in this segment. Now, as you look at this pricing chart, the hollow dot on the Model X means that's where the three-row model starts. One of the biggest misconceptions I've heard out there in the Model X versus EV9 debate is that you might as well just get a Model X because it gets the tax credit and therefore it's cheaper than the Kia. That's not true if you're talking about the three-row model, because the three-row model price tag takes it over the price cap and it no longer gets the tax credit. The EV9 gets $3,750 on the hood right now because it's being built in South Korea, but when that production moves to the United States a little bit later this year, it will qualify for a $3,750 federal tax credit. And that's all versions, including the fully loaded model. So there's definitely an advantage there on that front. Of course, we also have the Rivian R1S, we have the Volvo EX90, and then we have a number of upcoming options. But at the moment, this is basically all you've got to choose from if we're talking about pure electric three-row vehicles in this category. I guess you could say that we have the Mercedes-Benz EQS and the Mercedes-Benz EQB, but neither of those things is really the same thing here. So let's roll through the competition now. Obviously, the first one we have to talk about is the Rivian R1S. This was our EV of the year for 2024 because this is an honest-to-goodness three-row EV. That three-row SUV, I should say, that just so happens to be an EV. And that's the best way to think of this. If you're looking for a three-row Grand Cherokee or a three-row Range Rover, something like that, and you want an electric one, then the Rivian is a great option. Also, though, if you're looking at a top-end version of the EV9, you'd do well to put the Rivian on your shopping list because it's going to be about the same price. $76,700 is where the R1S starts with the smallest battery pack, dual electric motors, and 3 rows of seats. You'll also get a $3,750 tax credit on it, assuming you qualify, of course. If you get carried away with options on the Rivian, you can get it up to about $110,000. But of course, you can also get things on the Rivian you just won't find on the Kia, like quad motors, absolutely wicked 0 to 60 times, a huge battery pack with about 400 miles of range, and you can definitely get almost 400 miles of real-world range in the Rivian as well. Actually, I should say when we're talking about performance, every version of the Rivian is going to be wicked fast. Even the dual motor models are really, really swift. Which vehicle is right for you is going to depend on whether you want something that's a little bit closer to the ground or you want the off-road clearance, whether you want something that's going to be cheaper in the long run to maintain, that's probably going to be the Kia, or whether you want something that's a bit more selective, and the brand obviously says something about the vehicle. Rivian, obviously, it's a more expensive brand generally. Kia, this is the most expensive Kia, and it's going to be parked right there on dealer lots with a lot of less expensive Kias. Of course, we have CarPlay and Android Auto in the Kia, more mainstream features, more mainstream feel to the vehicle, etc., even though it is an EV. And on the Rivian, it's definitely that EV startup culture going on there. We're getting a lot of software updates, and Rivian has made some significant strides with the software over the past year or so. But maintenance costs and long-term reliability are a little bit of a question mark with the Rivian. I know that when I called my own insurance company to get an insurance quote on these two vehicles, the Rivian was about 15 to 20% more expensive depending on which insurance company I called. So it's certainly going to be more expensive to keep around. If you plan on charging with an NACS connector or at a supercharger location, you should know that Rivian is a 400-volt native company at the moment. So it's actually going to work a little bit better and more reliably on the supercharger network. Charging speeds are going to be a lot slower in the EV9 on the supercharger network than at an Electrify America station. So there's definitely a convenience side to this. Moving on, we have the Volvo EX90. In my mind, this is the most direct competitor to the EV9, especially the top-end EV9s, because the form factor of the vehicle is very, very similar. They're almost exactly the same size. They're certainly more on-road focused three-row vehicles and certainly more family-focused vehicles as well. Also, the EX9 is a little bit more value-oriented, I would say, than some people had expected, including myself. When I first saw the EX90, especially with some of the pricing that Volvo has been able to get away with, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but it's true, on some of their vehicles, I had expected the EX90 to be a lot more expensive than it will be. It's going to start at $77,990, and it comes pretty darn well equipped. You get about 400 horsepower from that dual motor system, that's standard, and we get a bigger battery pack than we find on the EV9, so 300 miles of range standard on that model. Also, the DC fast charge times are pretty reasonable. It'll peak at around 210 kilowatts, so it's actually going to be very similar in terms of its charging speed, apparently, to the Kia EV9. But it's a 400-volt nominal EV, and Volvo has, of course, signed up for the NACS network and supercharging network as well, which means it's actually going to charge faster on a supercharger versus the EV9. We don't have any crash test information on either of these vehicles, but if I had to put my own kids in the car, I would bet on the Volvo before I bet on the Kia. Now, of course, the Volvo is going to get more expensive. If you want to get the performance trim, which gives you even more power, that'll be at least $87,840, and we don't know where the pricing will end on the Volvo because we only have entry-level prices. The back seat is also a little bit smaller on the Volvo. That's something to keep in mind. And the third row is even smaller still than the EV9. The EV9 is really well packaged. It's almost minivan-like back there in the rear. The EX90, the dimensions really are more like the XC90. It just so happens that this is an electric version. Moving along to the Tesla Model X, the one that everybody wants to know about. The story with the Model X is that it's a lot more expensive than a lot of folks really realize. Let's go over that now. Minimum point of entry, $81,380. Now, the way the federal tax credit works is that destination charge is not included in the price cap. So essentially, this is just a hair under $80,000 plus destination getting you over $81,000. And that means that that is the only model that will get the tax credit. You definitely have to keep that in mind because if you want a red one, you don't get a tax credit on a red one. If you want a two-row one with a light-colored interior, you don't get a tax credit on that either. Just the base model, essentially. If you want a three-row Model X, it's going to be at least $84,880. That's $9,000 more effectively than an EV9, and I'm talking about the top-end EV9. And if you want a six-seat version, like the EV9 is, that will be at least $87,880. The options are kind of expensive here. Lighter color is an extra cost option. The third row is an extra cost option. The wheels are an extra cost option. And I'm not even talking about full self-driving or the enhanced autopilot. Those get pretty expensive, and that's how you get up to nearly $120,000 in the Model X. Now, on the other hand, we do get a bigger battery pack, and we get slightly better efficiency because of the more aerodynamic shape. Unquestionably, we also have better handling in the Model X. The Model X also does not suffer from the ride quality issues that I personally find in the Model 3 and Model Y because it has an adaptive air suspension, so it actually rides really nicely. Now, on the downside, no CarPlay, no Android Auto. I know a lot of folks want that feature, and I am not a big fan of the Falcon Wing doors. And actually, a lot of people that I know that own Model X's, they're not a fan of the Falcon Wing doors either. One unintended consequence with the Falcon Wing design is that if you are planning on putting an adult in the middle seat, say you have child seats in there and you want someone to sit in the middle between the child seats, you have a lot less headroom because of where the hinges are in the Falcon Wing door. if you're sitting there in the middle. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. Now, obviously, it has native supercharging capability, and if you do live near a supercharger, it's going to be the easiest one to use on that particular network. Now, coming up this year, we do seem to have a decent number of new options that are at least on the horizon. We have the Volkswagen ID Buzz. We don't know pricing on this one. It's probably going to start in the same range as the EV9, but don't expect it to go further on a battery because we know it's going to have a smaller pack than the largest one in the EV9. It's going to be 86 kilowatt hours, so most folks are assuming it's going to be around 250 to 260 miles of range. On the other hand, the interior is literally minivan roomy because it is an electric minivan. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the ID Buzz will not be getting a tax credit because it won't be built in the US. Instead, it's going to be built in Germany, not in the same factory that's producing the ID4. If you're shopping for a three-row EV, you could also consider the EQB. That's sort of within the price range here, but you're going to get less range, less performance. It's obviously less EV focused, and it is much, much smaller. Then we have the EQS. That's really the more direct competitor to the Model X in upper end trims. The EQS is pretty expensive. The third row is optional, of course. We have the upcoming Escalade IQ. Expect that to be fantastically expensive. And the Cadillac Vistic, which is going to be less expensive, more similarly sized to the EV9. I am really curious about the Vistic because we are seeing this really blurring of cost lines between mainstream entries like the EV9, which gets pretty expensive, and luxury entries, since the vehicles aren't intrinsically more or less expensive than one another. We then, of course, have the related cousin from Hyundai, formerly known as the Ioniq 7. It will now be called the Ioniq 9, and we should see that this calendar year, likely on sale before December. Then we have the Lucid Gravity that should be on sale at some point soon, and the Wagoneer S. Ford has delayed their three-row EV SUV. We don't know when it's going to come, but apparently Ford is focusing on something less expensive for their next EV. So I'm personally a little bit more excited about that. Bottom line, the EV9 is a great option. And I would say if you're looking for an affordable three-row vehicle, especially for around town duty, definitely go for the EV9. And I might even be willing to go for the rear-wheel drive base motor in the EV9 because for around town duty, that's going to be just fine. The all-wheel drive option, that's definitely a solid option to choose, but I think I would choose the rear-wheel drive one if you don't ever plan to go where you would need all-wheel drive because you will get the extra range in that model. If you've worked your way all the way up to the top-end trim, the one that we were driving in this video, that's where things get tricky. Honestly, I would wait for the EX90. I would check that out if I were you. Drive them both back to back, decide which one you like. I think I would probably get the Volvo. I also think I would get the Rivian R1S over the top-end version of the EV9 because by the time you've paid $77 some odd thousand for your Kia, you could just jump right into a Rivian, have a more premium experience, better ride quality, the adaptive air suspension, etc. There are some quirks with the Rivian. I really dislike the fact that it doesn't have CarPlay. I know I keep saying that, but survey after survey says new car shoppers certainly want that feature. Android Auto, if you have an Android device, I'm not being anti-Android, just smartphone integration seems to be what customers are actually interested in, but Rivian does not seem to be interested in giving us that particular feature. I would say it's hard to go wrong with either of these options in the US right now, but again, lower end cost, lower end MSRP, I would go for the Kia, but by the time you've worked your way up to the top, I would say check out some of those luxury alternatives. We don't know if they're going to be as reliable as the Kia, but they're certainly going to be nicer inside and outside. And if you're spending $77,000 on your EV, I'm going to guess that an extra 10 to 15% bump on your insurance costs probably won't break the bank. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would you choose if you're shopping in this segment, or have you already chosen? Let us know what you ended up picking. I'll see all of you later.